The morning sun peeked through the curtains of Margaret Anderson's penthouse apartment. She stood by the window, coffee cup in hand, watching the city wake up below. At 55, she had everything money could buy, except love. The divorce, papers on her desk reminded her of that. Her phone buzzed. It was her daughter Rachel. "Mom, have you heard? David Sterling is back in town." Margaret nearly dropped her cup. David Sterling. The man who broke her heart 30 years ago. The man she never truly got over. "What do you mean he's back?" Margaret's voice trembled. "His company just bought the old Miller building. It's all over the business news." "Mom, are you okay?" Margaret sat down, her legs suddenly weak. "I'm fine, honey. I need to go." She hung up and walked to her closet, pulling out an old shoebox. Inside was a faded photograph, her and David at their high school prom. They were so young, so in love, before the scandal, before his family lost everything, before he disappeared, without saying goodbye. Now he was back and probably richer than ever. Margaret had heard rumors about his success in Europe, how he'd built an empire from nothing. She wondered if he ever thought about her, about what they had. Her assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Miss Anderson, the board meeting starts in 30 minutes. Right. She was CEO of Anderson Enterprises now. She couldn't let old memories distract her. The company was facing its biggest crisis yet, a hostile takeover attempt by none other than Maxwell Corporation, run by the ruthless James Maxwell, her ex-husband. Margaret fixed her makeup, straightened her designer suit, and headed for the elevator. The doors were about to close when a hand stopped them. "Hold the elevator, please," that voice. She knew that voice. David Sterling stepped in, looking even more handsome than she remembered. Silver hair at his temples, but the same intense blue eyes. He froze when he saw her. "Margaret?" "David." The elevator seemed to move in slow motion. 30 years of unspoken words hung in the air between them. "You look wonderful," he said softly. "What are you doing here, David?" "I have a meeting with James Maxwell." Margaret's heart stopped. "James, why?" "He's selling Maxwell Corporation, and I'm buying it." The elevator dinged, arriving at the lobby. David held the door open, looking at her with those eyes that still made her weak in the knees. "Have dinner with me tonight, Margaret. There's something you need to know, something I should have told you 30 years ago." Before she could answer, her phone rang. It was the hospital. "Mrs. Anderson, it's about your sister Jennifer. There's been an accident." Margaret's world spun. Jennifer, the perfect sister, the one who married David after he left town, the sister who stole her happiness. Is she alive?" "She's asking for you. And she's saying something about a letter you were never supposed to see." David watched Margaret's face turn pale. He reached for her arm, steadying her. "What's wrong?" "Jennifer, she's in the hospital. David, she's your wife. You should—" "Ex-wife," he corrected. "We divorced 5 years ago." "Margaret, whatever Jennifer has to say, I think it's time for the truth to come out. All of it." Margaret looked at her watch. The board meeting, the hostile takeover, James's schemes, and now Jennifer's accident and David's return. It was too much. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. The past was catching up, and long-buried secrets were about to surface. Lives would change, hearts would break, and maybe, just maybe, a love story 30 years in the making would finally get its second chance. David's hand was still on her arm, warm and steady. "Just like before, just like always. We need to go to the hospital," she said. He nodded, already leading her toward his car. "Together?" The word held so much meaning, so much history, so much hope. "Together," she agreed. As they drove through the city streets, neither spoke. But both knew that after today, nothing would ever be the same. The truth was coming out, and with it, the chance to right old wrongs and heal old wounds, and perhaps to find love again. Little did they know that Jennifer's accident was no accident at all, and the letter she mentioned, it was just the tip of a very dangerous iceberg, one that could destroy them all. James Maxwell watched from his office window as his ex-wife drove away with David Sterling. He picked up his phone. "It's done. Margaret's on her way to the hospital. Make sure Jennifer remembers her part of the plan." He hung up, smiling. Soon, very soon, he would have everything. The company, the money, and most importantly, his revenge. But fate had other plans, because sometimes love is stronger than hate. And sometimes the heart remembers what the mind tries to forget. The truth was about to change everything. And nobody, not Margaret, not David, not James, and not even Jennifer, was ready for what would happen next. The hospital corridors were quiet, except for their footsteps. Margaret clutched her purse tightly as she and David approached Jennifer's room. A nurse stopped them before they could enter. "Mrs. Anderson, your sister is awake, but she's very weak. Try not to upset her." Margaret nodded, then turned to David. "Maybe you should wait here." "No," he said firmly. "Whatever Jennifer has to say, I need to hear it too." They entered the room together. Jennifer lay in the hospital bed looking small and fragile. Her perfectly maintained blonde hair was messy, her face pale without makeup. When she saw them, her eyes widened. "David, what are you doing here?" "Hello, Jennifer," he said coldly. Margaret moved closer to the bed. "What happened?" "They said it was an accident." Jennifer's hands twisted in the sheets. "The brakes, they didn't work. My car just went straight through the intersection." She paused, looking at David. "It was just like Mom and Dad's accident." David's face hardened. "What are you talking about?" "The letter," Jennifer whispered. "Margaret, in my house, in the blue box in my closet. You need to get it before James does." "James? What does he have to do with this?" "Everything." Jennifer started crying. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. I'm so sorry for what we did to you." A doctor entered the room. "I need to examine the patient now." Outside in the hallway, Margaret leaned against the wall. "David, what did she mean about your parents' accident?" "They died in a car crash when I was 18, right before—" He stopped, pain crossing his face. "Right before I left town." Margaret's phone buzzed again. A text from Rachel. "Mom, where are you? Maxwell Corp just called an emergency board meeting. They're voting on the takeover today." "I have to go," Margaret said. "The company—" "I'll go to Jennifer's house," David said. "I'll find that letter. I'm coming with you." "The board meeting—" "Can wait. David, I need to know the truth, all of it." They drove to Jennifer's expensive townhouse in silence. Inside, everything was perfect, just like Jennifer herself had always been. Perfect grades, perfect marriage, perfect life. While Margaret had struggled as a single mom, Jennifer had sailed through life without a care. Or so Margaret had thought. The blue box was right where Jennifer said. Inside was an envelope, yellowed with age, addressed to Margaret. Her hands shook as she opened it. "Dear Margaret, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. You deserve to know the truth about that night 30 years ago." Margaret gasped as she read. The words blurred through her tears. "James paid me to seduce David. He wanted control of the Sterling family company, and David was in his way. Never meant to fall in love with him. But by then it was too late. The accident that killed his parents wasn't an accident at all. James arranged everything. He threatened to expose me if I didn't marry David. He said he'd tell everyone what I'd done. I'm so sorry, Margaret. You and David were meant to be together. I ruined everything. Your sister, Jennifer." David took the letter, reading it himself. His face went white with rage. "James killed my parents for a company?" His hands clenched into fists. "And Jennifer, she knew all this time?" Margaret's phone rang again. "Rachel. Mom, James just announced that he's selling the company to Sterling Industries, but that's not all. He's saying you killed his brother 20 years ago. He has evidence." "What? That's impossible." "There's security footage, Mum. From the night Uncle Robert died. They're showing it at the board meeting." Right now, Margaret felt. The room spin. Robert Maxwell's death had been ruled a suicide. She'd found him in his office, already gone. James had never forgiven her, claiming she'd driven his brother to it. But the security footage, there wasn't any. She'd checked back then, unless... "David," she whispered. "James is framing me, just like he framed you 30 years ago." David pulled out his phone, dialing quickly. "John, I need everything you can find on James Maxwell. Everything. Especially anything about his brother Robert's death." Margaret sank into a chair. The company meeting, if they vote today, I'll lose everything. No, David said firmly. You won't lose anything. Not this time. He knelt in front of her, taking her hands. Margaret, I left 30 years ago because James showed me pictures, you with another man. He said you were playing me, using me to get my family's company. What? David, no, I never... I know that now. The man in those pictures, it was Robert Maxwell, wasn't it? You were working together against James even back then. Margaret nodded slowly. Robert wanted to expose James's illegal dealings. He had proof. The night he died, I was supposed to meet him. He said he had documents that would put James away for good. David's phone buzzed, a text from his investigator. Found something. Security footage from Maxwell Corp, night of Robert's death. The original footage. James switched it. Margaret stood up. We need that footage, and we need it now. David smiled grimly. I think it's time we crashed that board meeting. They rushed to the car, but before they could get in, shots rang out. David pushed Margaret down, covering her with his body. A black SUV screeched away. Are you okay? David helped her up, checking for injuries. I'm fine. David, this is getting dangerous. He pulled her close, and for a moment they were 18 again, with their whole lives ahead of them. I lost you once, he said softly. I won't lose you again. Margaret's heart raced. After 30 years, his touch still sent shivers through her. But there was no time for romance, not yet. First, they had a company to save, a murderer to expose, and 30 years of lies to unravel. And somewhere in the city, James Maxwell was, watching, waiting, planning his next move. Because some men would do anything for power, even kill the woman he once loved. The game was on, and this time, the stakes were higher than ever. The elevator to the Anderson Enterprises boardroom felt like it was moving too slowly. Margaret straightened her jacket, trying to stay calm. David stood close beside her, his presence giving her strength. Are you ready? He asked. No, but we don't have a choice. The doors opened to chaos. Reporters crowded the hallway, cameras flashing. Rachel ran toward them, her face streaked with tears. Mom, thank God you're here. They're about to vote. Inside the boardroom, James Maxwell stood at the head of the table, looking triumphant. The security footage played on a large screen behind him, grainy video showing what looked like Margaret entering Robert's office the night he died. Ah, Margaret, so nice of you to join us. James smiled coldly. We were just discussing your murderous past. That footage is fake, David announced, his voice carrying across the room. And we can prove it. James's smile faltered slightly. Mr. Sterling, this doesn't concern you. Actually, it does. David pulled out his phone. You see, I just received the original security footage from that night. Would you like to see it, James? Or should I tell everyone what it shows? The room went silent. Board members looked back and forth between James and David. You're bluffing, James said, but sweat appeared on his forehead. Margaret stepped forward. Tell them, James. Tell them how you killed your own brother. She's lying, James shouted. She's the murderer. She's trying to save her company. The company you're trying to steal, Rachel spoke up. Just like you tried to steal Sterling Industries 30 years ago. James lunged for David's phone, but security guards grabbed him. In the struggle, the phone fell, skidding across the floor. Margaret picked it up. The video was already playing. The real footage showed James entering Robert's office that night, the two brothers arguing, James pulling out a gun. Turn it. Half? James tried to break free from the guards, but it was too late. Everyone had seen enough. The truth was out. Police sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. It's over, James, Margaret said quietly. James looked around wildly, then suddenly broke free. He pulled a gun from his jacket. If I'm going down, you're coming with me, the gun pointed at Margaret. David moved to shield her, but Rachel was faster. She grabbed a heavy crystal award from the desk and swung it at James's hand. The gun went flying. Police burst into the room, tackling James to the ground. James Maxwell, you're under arrest for the murder of Robert Maxwell and the attempted murder of Jennifer Anderson. As they led James away in handcuffs, he kept screaming. You don't understand. I did it all for her. Everything was for Margaret. The room erupted in chaos again. Reporters shouted questions. Board members huddled in groups, whispering. Margaret felt lightheaded. David's arm went around her waist, supporting her. "Let's get you out of here." In David's car, Margaret finally broke down. 30 years of pain and confusion poured out. "James, he loved me? That's why he destroyed everything?" "Our obsession isn't love," David said gently. "He wanted to possess you, not love you." Rachel called from the hospital. "Mum, Aunt Jennifer's awake again. She's asking for you. And there's something else. The doctors found something in her blood. She's been poisoned. Slowly, over years." "James," Margaret whispered. "He's been poisoning her." They rushed back to the hospital. Jennifer looked even worse than before. "Margaret," she said weakly, "there's more you need to know about Rachel." "What about Rachel?" She's not James's daughter. She's David's." Margaret felt the world tilt. "What?" "That night before David left, you were together. I knew you were pregnant. James knew too. He threatened to hurt the baby if you didn't marry him. That's why I helped him. To protect Rachel." David sat down heavily in a chair. "Rachel is my daughter. I wanted to tell you," Margaret said through tears. "But James said he'd kill you if I did, like he killed your parents." Rachel appeared in the doorway, face pale. She'd heard everything. "Dad?" She looked at David with new eyes. He stood up, opening his arms, and Rachel ran into them. Father and daughter together at last. Jennifer smiled weakly at the scene. At least something good came from all the lies. A nurse rushed in. "Her blood. Pressure's dropping." Doctors flooded the room, pushing them out. In the hallway, Margaret paced while David held Rachel. "Do you think she'll make it?" Rachel asked. "I don't know, honey." Margaret's phone rang. It was her lawyer. "Mrs. Anderson, there's something you need to know. James Maxwell has escaped custody." The words hit like ice water. "What?" "The police are searching, but he's gone. And he left a note. It just says it's not over." Margaret looked at David and Rachel, finally reunited. She thought of Jennifer fighting for her life. And somewhere out there, James was waiting, planning his revenge. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because some men don't know how to let go, and some secrets refuse to stay buried. In the distance, thunder rumbled. A storm was coming, and this time, it would change everything. The rain pounded against the windows of Margaret's penthouse. Police officers moved through the rooms, setting up surveillance equipment. After James's escape, they weren't taking any chances. Rachel sat on the couch, looking through old photo albums. David stood behind her, watching as she traced her fingers over pictures of him from 30 years ago. "You have his eyes," Margaret said softly, joining them. "I always hoped you wouldn't notice." "I used to look in the mirror sometimes," Rachel admitted, "and wonder why I didn't look anything like James." The doorbell rang. Everyone tensed. A police officer checked the security camera and nodded. It was safe. He opened the door to reveal an elderly woman. "Rose?" Margaret gasped. "What are you doing here?" Rose had been the Sterling's housekeeper before David's parents died. She looked frail now, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "I saw the news," she said, her hands clutching a worn leather bag. "About James Maxwell's arrest and escape. It's time you knew everything." David helped her to a chair. "What do you mean, Rose?" "I was there that night. The night your parents died." She pulled an old envelope from her bag. "I saw what really happened." Margaret sat down, her heart racing. "More secrets?" "James came to the house," Rose continued. "He was arguing with your father about the company merger. Your mother tried to intervene. That's when I saw him put something in their car. Something small attached to the brake line. You saw him sabotage the car?" David's voice shook with anger. "I was scared. He threatened my family if I ever told, but I kept proof." She opened the envelope and pulled out photographs. "I took these from my window. You can see him clearly, working under the car." David stared at the photos, his hands trembling. All these years, the hospital called. Jennifer was stabilizing, but the doctors had found something strange in her latest blood tests. The poison in her system matched an unusual chemical compound, the same one used in industrial brake fluid. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered. "James didn't just poison Jennifer. He's been using her to perfect his method. The same thing he used on your parents." Rachel's phone buzzed with a text. Her face went white. "Mom, it's from James. The message read, "Hello, daughter, or should I say David's daughter. Meet me at the old Sterling house in 1 hour. Come. Alone or Mummy dearest won't live to see tomorrow." "You can't go," David said immediately. "He'll kill Mum." Margaret took the phone, reading the message again. "The old Sterling house. It burned down years ago. Why would he want to meet there?" Rose spoke up. "The house didn't just burn. James set that fire too, to destroy evidence. But he didn't. Know about the secret room in the basement?" "What secret room?" David asked. "Your father's private office, where he kept all his records. Records of James's illegal dealings, his threats, everything. The room was built like a vault, fireproof. All the evidence is still there." Suddenly the lights went out. The security system's backup power kicked in, bathing the room in red emergency lighting. "He's here," Margaret whispered. A voice came through the intercom system. "James, did you really think a few police officers could stop me? I built this building, Margaret. I know every way in and out." David pulled Margaret and Rachel close. "Where are the police officers?" The apartment was silent. Too silent. "Don't worry," James's voice continued. "They're just sleeping. A little something in their coffee. Now let's talk about what happens next." Rose stood up, surprisingly steady. "The secret room, David. The evidence isn't the only thing your father kept there. There's something else, something James has been looking for all these years." "What is it, Rose?" "The real shares of Sterling Industries. Your father never sold them to James. He hid them. The paperwork James used to take over the company, it was all fake." A slow clap echoed through the room. James stepped out of the shadows, gun in hand. "Well done, Rose. I've been trying to find those shares for 30 years. He smiled coldly. "And now you're going to tell me exactly where they are." "Never," Rose spat. James aimed the gun at Margaret. "Tell me, or she dies." David moved to protect Margaret, but James just laughed. "How touching. Still playing the hero, David, just like your father, right before I killed him." Rachel edged toward the kitchen while James was focused on the others. Her hand found a knife. "You destroyed so many lives," Margaret said, keeping James's attention. "All for what? Money? Power?" "For you," James shouted. "Everything I did was for you. I loved you since high school, but you only had eyes for him." He gestured at David with the gun. "I had to make you see, had to make you understand." "You're insane," David said quietly. "No, I'm just a man who knows what he wants, and I always get what I want." Thunder crashed outside. In that moment of distraction, Rachel threw the knife. It caught James in the arm, making him drop the gun. David tackled him. They crashed into a table, fighting desperately. "Margaret," Rose called. "The shares, they're in my bag, the real ones, take them." Margaret grabbed the bag, but James saw her. Breaking free from David, he lunged for her. Rachel screamed as James grabbed her mother, dragging her toward the balcony doors. "If I can't have you," he snarled, "no one will." The storm raged outside as James forced the doors open. Rain and wind whipped through the apartment. 30 stories up, the city lights blurred in the rain. Margaret struggled, but James was too strong. "Let her go," David moved closer. "Stay back." James pulled Margaret closer to the edge. "One more step, and we both go over." Lightning flashed, illuminating James's face. In that moment, Margaret saw something she'd never seen before. Fear. Because James Maxwell, the man who had orchestrated 30 years of manipulation and murder, was finally losing control, and he was terrified. The truth about his crimes was out. The evidence was found. His perfectly constructed world was crumbling. But a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind, and as the storm raged on, no one knew who would survive the night. Lightning flashed again, closer this time. Margaret felt the rain soaking through her clothes as James held her at the edge of the balcony. 30 stories below, police lights started flashing in the street. "It's over, James," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Let me go." "Over?" He laughed, a harsh sound that scared her more than his anger. "No, my dear, this is just the beginning." David took another careful step forward. "Think about what you're doing, James. If anything happens to Margaret, you'll have nothing left." "I already have nothing," James shouted over the wind. "You took everything from me, both of you." Rachel's voice came from behind them, trembling but determined. That's not true. You had me. I thought you were my father for 30 years. Rachel. Stay back, Margaret pleaded, but Rachel kept talking. You taught me to ride a bike. You came to my school plays. Why? If you hated us so much, why did you pretend to love me? Something flickered in James's eyes. His grip on Margaret loosened slightly. I didn't pretend, he whispered. You were the only pure thing in all of this, the only thing that wasn't built on lies. Rose stepped forward, her old bones steady despite the wind and rain. Then prove it, James. Prove you can love something more than your hatred. A police helicopter appeared overhead, its spotlight cutting through the storm. Police bullhorns called from below. James Maxwell, we have the building surrounded. James pulled Margaret closer to the edge. They'll never take me alive, and if I go, she goes with me. That's when they heard it. A small sound, almost lost. In the storm, a child's cry. Everyone turned. There, in the doorway to the apartment, stood a little girl in pink pajamas, maybe 5 years old. Grandma, she called, scared. Sophie, Rachel gasped. Baby, go back inside. But Sophie stood there, tears mixing with rain on her face. The thunder's scary, Mommy. Margaret felt James freeze. She heard his breath catch. You have a daughter? He asked Rachel. Yes, your granddaughter. The one you would have known if you hadn't let your obsession destroy everything. Sophie took a few steps onto the balcony, her little feet unsteady in the wind. Sophie, no! Several voices called at once. What happened next seemed to play out in slow motion. A powerful gust of wind hit the balcony. Sophie stumbled. James instinctively let go of Margaret, reaching for the child. David grabbed Margaret, pulling her to safety. Rachel ran for her daughter, and James caught Sophie just as she was about to fall, cradling her against his chest. For a moment, everyone stood frozen. The mighty James Maxwell, who had orchestrated decades of manipulation and murder, held a crying child and looked completely lost. She has Margaret's eyes, he said softly. Then he looked up at Rachel. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. He handed Sophie to Rachel and stepped back. Another lightning flash illuminated his face, tears streaming down his cheeks. James, Margaret started, but he shook his head. No, don't. He looked at all of them. Margaret, David, Rachel, Sophie, Rose. I destroyed everything because I couldn't let go, couldn't accept that you loved him more than me. Police burst onto the balcony, guns drawn. Hands up. James raised his hands slowly. As they handcuffed him, he looked at Margaret one last time. I did love you, in my own twisted way. They led him away. Sophie buried her face in Rachel's neck, still crying. Inside the apartment, they found the police officers starting to wake up. Whatever James had drugged them with was wearing off. Rose sat heavily in a chair, clutching her bag with the precious documents. It's really over this time, but Margaret wasn't so sure. She'd seen something in James's eyes at the end. Something that worried her. Her phone rang. The hospital. Mrs. Anderson, your sister Jennifer, and she's asking for a lawyer. She says she needs to make a confession. Something about James Maxwell. And there's someone else here, a young man. He says he's James's son. Margaret nearly dropped the phone. What? David took her hand. What is it? James has a son no one knew about. She looked at him with wide eyes. And Jennifer knows who he is. Rachel hugged Sophie closer. Fate's never really over, is it? No, Margaret said quietly. In fact, I think this might be just the beginning of an even bigger storm. Because some secrets refuse to stay buried. Some lies have lives of their own. And sometimes, the past doesn't just come back to haunt you. Sometimes it comes back to destroy everything you've built from the ashes of what came before. David pulled Margaret close, and she leaned into his strength. They'd survived this round, but both knew that somewhere in a jail cell, James Maxwell was smiling, because he knew something they didn't, something that would change everything. Again, the real game was just beginning, and this time the stakes were higher than ever before. Outside, the storm began to ease, but inside the hearts of everyone involved, another storm was brewing, one that would test their love, their loyalty, and their very survival. Because in this game of power and revenge, No one was truly innocent, and no one was truly safe. The hospital waiting room was quiet at 3 in the morning. Margaret sat with her head in her hands while David paced. Rachel had taken Sophie home, but not before making them promise to call with any news. "Mrs. Anderson?" A nurse appeared. "Your sister can see you now." Jennifer looked worse than ever, but her eyes were clear. A young man sat by her bed, handsome, maybe 30, with James's strong jaw and penetrating gaze. "Margaret," Jennifer said weakly. "Meet Adam. Adam Maxwell." The young man stood, extending his hand. "Hello, Aunt Margaret." Margaret felt dizzy. "Aunt?" "James is my father," Adam said, "though he never acknowledged me publicly. My mother was his secretary, Catherine Wells." David stopped pacing. "Catherine, she disappeared right after my parents' accident," Adam finished. "Now you know why." Jennifer coughed, and everyone turned to her. "I need to tell you everything, about James, about Adam, about all of it." She took a shaky breath. James knew about Adam from the beginning. He paid Catherine to disappear, to raise Adam in secret. Because Adam was his backup plan, his insurance policy. "Insurance for what?" Margaret asked. "For this moment, when everything fell apart." Jennifer's voice grew weaker. "Adam is legally James's heir. Everything, the companies, the properties, the offshore accounts, it all goes to him." Margaret looked at Adam sharply. "Is that why you're here? To claim your inheritance?" Adam smiled, and in that smile, Margaret saw James. The same calculating intelligence, the same hidden agenda. "I'm here for justice," he said smoothly. "For my mother, who lived in fear all these years. For myself, denied my birthright." "Your father is a murderer," David said flatly. "My father is a businessman who got his hands dirty, just like your father, Mr. Sterling, just like everyone in our world." Adam stood up. "The only difference is my father got caught." Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She opened it and gasped. It was a photo of James in his jail cell, unconscious on the floor. "What is it?" David asked. Before she could answer, alarms started blaring in the hospital. "Code blue! Code blue in room 507. Jennifer's room." Doctors rushed in, pushing them out. Through the window, Margaret watched in horror as Jennifer convulsed, foam forming at her mouth. "She's crashing! Get her! Crash cut!" Adam stood calmly, watching. Too calmly. Margaret grabbed his arm. "What did you do?" He shrugged off her grip. "I didn't do anything, but it seems the poison father used on her finally did its job." David moved to stop Adam from leaving, but 2 large men in suits appeared in the hallway. "I wouldn't," Adam said pleasantly. "My security team takes their job very seriously." He straightened his expensive tie. "Oh, and you might want to check on father. I heard prison can be quite dangerous for men like him." He walked away as Jennifer's heart monitor flatlined. Margaret's phone rang. "The prison. Mrs. Anderson, I'm afraid there's been an incident. James Maxwell was found unresponsive in his cell. He's being transported to the hospital." David held Margaret as her legs gave out. "He planned this," she whispered. "James planned everything. Adam is his revenge." More alarms sounded as doctors called out orders, trying to save Jennifer, but Margaret knew it was too late, because this wasn't just about murder anymore. This was about legacy, about passing the torch of revenge to a new generation. Rose appeared, out of breath. "The documents! Someone broke into my house. The real Sterling shares, they're gone!" David cursed. "Adam, he's been one step ahead this whole time." Margaret's phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "Like father, like son. The game continues. Sweet dreams." Attached was a photo of Sophie sleeping in her bed at Rachel's house. Margaret's blood ran cold. "Rachel, call Rachel!" David was already dialing, but there was no answer. "We have to go, now!" They ran for the elevator, but when the doors opened, they found a manila envelope on the floor. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 words written in James's handwriting. "Checkmate, darling." The lights in the hospital flickered, then went out. In the darkness, Margaret felt David's hand find hers, but for the first time, his touch didn't make her feel safe. Because somewhere out there, Adam Maxwell was smiling his father's smile, and moving his father's pieces on a board they didn't even know they were playing on, and Rachel and Sophie were in danger. The next generation of an old war had begun, and this time, the rules had changed. Because Adam Maxwell wasn't just seeking revenge, he was seeking destruction. Complete and total destruction of everyone and everything connected to the Sterling and Anderson names, and he had his father's patience, his father's resources, and something James never had: youth and nothing to lose. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning again, with deadlier stakes and darker purposes. And somewhere in a prison hospital, James Maxwell lay dying with a satisfied smile on his face, because his greatest revenge wasn't anything he'd done. It was what he'd created, a son who would finish what he started, a son who would destroy them all. Rachel's house was dark when they arrived. Police cars surrounded the property, their lights flashing silently in the night. No signs of forced entry, an officer reported. But the security system was disabled, and we found this. He handed Margaret a white rose with a note attached. History repeats itself. David's face went pale. A white rose. That's what the killer left after my parents' accident. Margaret rushed into the house, calling out, "Rachel, Sophie!" The house was empty, but nothing was disturbed. On Sophie's bed lay her favorite stuffed bear, and next to it, a tablet playing a video. Adam Maxwell's face filled the screen. "Hello, Margaret. By now, you've discovered your family is missing. Don't worry, they're safe, for now." His smile was cold, calculating. "You know, Father told me so many stories about you, about how you chose David over him, about how you ruined everything." The camera panned to show Rachel and Sophie, tied up but unharmed, in what looked like a warehouse. "Mommy?" Sophie was crying. "I want my mommy." Rachel tried to comfort her daughter despite her own bonds. "It's okay, baby. Everything's going to be okay." Adam came back into frame. Sweet scene, isn't it? Family, love, all the things Father never had. All the things you denied him. "You sick bastard," David growled at the screen. Now, Mr. Sterling, is that any way to talk to your daughters?" "Captor?" Adam's eyes glittered with malice. "Here's what's going to happen. You have 12 hours to transfer all of Anderson Enterprises and Sterling Industries to me. Everything, every share, every subsidiary, every penny." Margaret's hands shook. "And if we don't? Then little Sophie gets to watch her mother die, just like I watched my mother waste away, alone and forgotten." His voice hardened. "You have until noon tomorrow. I'll text you the details." The screen went black. David grabbed his phone, calling his security team. "I want every warehouse in the city checked. Focus on properties owned by Maxwell Corporation or its subsidiaries." Margaret sank onto Sophie's bed, clutching the stuffed bear. That's when she noticed something odd, a faint chemical smell. "David, wait." She sniffed the bear. "This smell, it's the same as the poison they found in Jennifer's system." Her phone rang. "The hospital. Mrs. Anderson, your sister, she's alive, barely. The doctors found an anomaly in the poison. It's not what we thought." "What do you mean?" "The chemical signature. It's not James Maxwell's formula. It's different, newer. Someone modified it." Margaret's mind raced. Catherine Wells, Adam's mother. David looked up sharply. "What about her?" "Jennifer said she disappeared after your parents' accident." "But what if she didn't just disappear? What if James sent her somewhere specific?" She called Rose. "The old Sterling house, you said there was a secret room in the basement. What exactly did James want to find there?" "Research," Rose answered. "Your father's research, David. He was developing new chemical compounds for the company's pharmaceutical division. And James stole that research," David realized. "Gave it to Catherine, who modified it over the years," Margaret finished, "teaching her son everything she knew." A new text arrived, a photo of Catherine Wells, looking much older but still elegant, standing in a laboratory. The caption read, "Mother says hello. She's been waiting 30 years for this moment." David's security team called back. "Sir, we found something. There's an old pharmaceutical research facility on the outskirts of town. It was owned by Sterling Industries before the takeover." "That's it." Margaret grabbed her coat. "That's where Catherine worked on the formulas. That's where Adam's holding them." They raced to the car, but Margaret's phone buzzed again. A video message. Catherine Wells appeared, her once beautiful face twisted with bitterness. "You don't know me, Margaret, but I know you. James told me everything. How you seduced him, then chose David instead. How you destroyed him." "That's not what happened," Margaret whispered. "Save your lies. My son will finish what his father started. And I'll finally have my revenge too." The video showed Rachel and Sophie being moved to a glass chamber. "You see, I've perfected the formula. No more slow poison. This version is much faster. One press of a button and the chamber fills with gas. They'll be dead in minutes." Adam appeared beside his mother, both wearing protective masks. "Tick-tock," he smiled. "Time's running out." They rushed to the facility, police cars following with sirens silent. The old building loomed ahead, dark except for one lit window. "There," David pointed. "Third floor." But as they got closer, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The entire building was rigged with explosives. Adam's voice came through a loudspeaker. "Welcome to the party. One wrong move and everything goes boom. Just like your parents' car, Mr. Sterling. Isn't symmetry beautiful?" Inside the building, Sophie's cries echoed through the empty halls. Margaret looked at David. In his eyes, she saw the same determination she felt. "We're going in," she said, "because sometimes history doesn't just repeat itself. Sometimes it gives you a chance to change it, to right old wrongs, to save not just the present, but the past as well." And as they stepped into the building, both knew that this night would end one of two ways, with a family reunited, or with a legacy of hatred claiming its final victims. The choice, as always, would come down to love versus revenge, and this time they couldn't afford to lose, because somewhere, above them, a little girl was crying for her mother, and a madman was smiling his father's smile, waiting to destroy everything just like 30 years ago. But this time they were ready. This time, they would fight back. Together. The old pharmaceutical facility smelled of dust and chemicals. Margaret and David moved carefully through the dark corridors, following Sophie's distant cries. "We need to split up," David whispered. "I'll try to find the control room, disable the explosives." Margaret grabbed his arm. "Be careful. We just found each other again. I can't lose you." He kissed her quickly, then disappeared into the darkness. Margaret continued upward, her heart pounding with each step. On the second floor, she found an old laboratory. Tables were covered with equipment, and on one wall hung photos, surveillance photos spanning 30 years, her at her wedding to James. David in Europe, Rachel growing up, Sophie being born. They'd been watching all this time. A woman's voice came from behind her. "Amazing what money and hatred can accomplish, isn't it?" Margaret turned. Catherine Wells stood in the doorway, elegant even after. All these years, her silver hair was perfectly styled, her designer outfit immaculate. "Why?" Margaret asked. "Why help James destroy so many lives?" "Destroy lives?" Catherine laughed bitterly. "You want to talk about destroyed lives? I loved James, really loved him. Not like you, using him to climb the social ladder." "That's not what happened." "No? Then why did you marry him right after David left? Why did you take his money, live in his house, spend 30 years pretending?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "He threatened to kill David, to kill my baby. What choice did I have?" "There's always a choice." Catherine moved to a computer, typing commands. "And now you have another one." Screens lit up around the room. One showed David in the basement, trying to disable the explosives. Another showed Rachel and Sophie in the glass chamber, and a third showed James in his hospital bed, flatlining as doctors rushed around him. "Choose, Margaret. Who lives? Who dies? Your love, your daughter, your granddaughter, or the father of your child? You're insane." "No. I'm a woman who watched the man she loved destroy himself over another woman, who raised his son in secret, teaching him everything he'd need to know. And now, that son will have everything his father wanted." Footsteps behind them. Adam entered wearing a protective suit. "Hello, Mother. Is she ready to choose?" "You don't have to do this," Margaret pleaded. "You're not James. You can be better." "Better?" Adam's eyes hardened. "I am better. Father let emotion cloud his judgment. I won't make that mistake. He pressed a button. Gas started seeping into the chamber where Rachel and Sophie were held. "Mom!" Rachel screamed, holding Sophie close. "Help us!" Margaret lunged for the controls, but Catherine blocked her way. First, sign these." She held out transfer papers. "Everything you own, everything David owns, signed over to Adam." "Don't do it, Margaret," David's voice came through the speakers. He'd found the control room. "The explosives are on a timer. We have 5 minutes." Adam smiled. 4 minutes now." "Tick-tock," Sophie's little voice carried through the speakers. "Grandma, I can't breathe." Margaret grabbed the papers, signing frantically. "There, now let them go." "Mother," Adam said softly, "show her what real loyalty looks like." Catherine pulled out a gun, aiming it at Margaret. "For James." But before she could pull the trigger, an explosion rocked the building. "No!" Adam rushed to the monitors. "The basement! Who's in the basement?" Through the smoke appeared a figure Margaret thought she'd never see again. James Maxwell. He looked terrible, pale, weak, barely standing. But his eyes burned with determination. "Hello, son. Did you really think I'd let you destroy everything I built?" "Father?" Adam stepped back. "You're supposed to be dead." Surprise. James smiled grimly. "I taught you everything you know about poison, but not everything I know." Catherine's hand trembled on the gun. "James, but how?" "I always knew this day would come, Catherine. Knew our son would try to take everything, just like I tried." He looked at Margaret. "Some cycles need to be broken." Another explosion shook the building. "David!" Margaret screamed. "I'm okay." His voice came through static. "But the whole place is going to blow." James grabbed the controls, pressing buttons frantically. "Father, stop!" Adam tried to interfere, but James pushed him away. "Enough. No more death. No more revenge." The chamber door clicked open. Rachel grabbed Sophie and ran. Catherine aimed her gun at James. "You promised me. Promised our son would have everything." "I promised a lot of things, Catherine. I was wrong." The building shook. Again. Parts of the ceiling began to fall. "We need to get out." Margaret grabbed for Rachel and Sophie as they appeared in the doorway. But Adam wasn't finished. He pulled out his own gun, pointing it at his father. "Everything I did was for you, to finish what you started. What I started was wrong," James shouted. "Don't become me, son. Be better." The floor beneath them groaned. Cracks appeared in the walls. David burst into the room. "The whole place is coming down." Catherine looked at James, tears in her eyes. "I loved you. I gave you a son." "I know." He stepped toward her. "I'm sorry I couldn't love you back." Adam's hand shook on the gun. "Father." The ceiling began to collapse. In the chaos that followed, shots rang out. Catherine screamed, Adam fell, and James Maxwell made his final choice. The choice that would change everything. Again. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Adam lay on the floor, blood spreading across his expensive suit. But the bullet hadn't come from his gun or Catherine's. It had come from James's. "Why?" Adam gasped, looking at his father with disbelief. James knelt beside his son, tears streaming down his face. "Because I love you too much to let you become me." The building shuddered again. More ceiling tiles crashed down around them. "We need to get out," David shouted, holding the door open. "Now!" Rachel ran past with Sophie in her arms. Margaret started to follow, but stopped when she saw Catherine standing frozen, staring at her son. "Catherine, we have to go. My baby." Catherine's gun clattered to the floor. "My perfect boy." James tried to lift Adam, but he was too weak from his illness. David rushed back in to help. Together, they carried Adam toward the exit. Catherine followed in a daze, Margaret guiding her along. They barely made it down 2 flights of stairs before the next explosion hit. The stairwell behind them collapsed. "This way." James led them through a maze of corridors. "There's a service." "Exit!" They burst out into the cool night air just as the building began to implode. Fire trucks and ambulances screamed in the distance. Adam was rushed to the hospital. Catherine sat in the back of a police car, staring blankly ahead. And James Maxwell, the man who had orchestrated 30 years of pain and suffering, collapsed onto a stretcher. "Margaret," he called weakly. She approached cautiously. David stood close behind her, protective as always. "I know it doesn't make up for anything," James whispered, "but I couldn't let him destroy his life like I destroyed mine." "By shooting him?" Margaret's voice shook with anger. "By stopping him." The bullet hit his shoulder. "He'll live." James closed his eyes. "The doctors say I won't. The poison in my system. There's no cure." Rachel appeared, holding a sleeping Sophie. "Is it really over?" James looked at his granddaughter, then at Rachel. "I never deserved to be your father. David did. He does." He pulled an envelope from his jacket. "This makes it official, my confession, everything I did, and a new will." "What about the companies?" David asked. "All the shares, everything. It goes to Rachel, to Sophie." He smiled sadly. "Let the next generation build something better than we did." Catherine screamed from the police car. "You promised me, you promised our son would have everything." "He'll have a chance at a real life," James said, "without hate, without revenge." He looked at Margaret. "Take care of him? Help him become a better man than his father?" Before she could answer, he convulsed. Medical teams rushed in, BP dropping, he's crashing. In the chaos that followed, Margaret found herself holding David's hand tightly. Rachel leaned against them, Sophie still, sleeping in her arms. A family, finally whole. Hours later, in the hospital waiting room, they got the news. James Maxwell was dead. Adam survived surgery. He would face charges, but James's confession would help his case. And Catherine? She sat in a jail cell, clutching old photos of herself with James, with their baby boy, lost in memories of what could have been. Jennifer was recovering. The doctors said she'd pull through. Rose brought them coffee and held Margaret while she finally broke down and cried. 30 years of pain, of fear, of pretending. It all came pouring out. David never let go of her hand. Rachel put Sophie to bed in a hospital room the staff had prepared. The little girl had slept through most of the drama, innocent and unaware of how close they'd all come to losing everything. "She looks like you did at that age," David told Rachel softly. "I wish I'd known sooner, that you were my real father. We have time now." All the time in the world. Margaret watched them from the doorway, her heart full. After all the lies, all the manipulation, the truth had finally set them free. But in another room of the same hospital, Adam Maxwell lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The nurse had brought him a package. Inside was a flash drive and a note in his father's handwriting. "Son, I stopped you because I love you, but I also taught you everything for a reason. The choice of what to do with that knowledge is now yours. Choose wisely." Father. Adam closed his eyes, tears sliding down his face. In her jail cell, Catherine smiled. Because some stories don't end, they just change. And sometimes the most dangerous legacy isn't hatred or revenge. It's the power to choose what happens next. Margaret held David close, watching their daughter and granddaughter sleep. "Do you think it's really over?" she whispered. He kissed her softly. "I think it's just beginning, but this time we'll face it together." Outside, the sun began to rise. A new day, a new chapter. And somewhere, in the ashes of the old pharmaceutical facility, among the ruins of 30 years of lies and manipulation, something stirred, a white rose somehow unburned, waiting to bloom again. Because in this world of power and passion, of love and betrayal, nothing ever really ends. It just transforms into something new, something unexpected, something that could heal or destroy. The choice, as always, would be theirs to make.